Selected 16th overall in the 2015 entry draft, Mathew Barzal has been a major piece for the Islanders since his first NHL season in 2017-18. Over his first 82 games, he netted 22 goals and 63 assists, landing him the Calder Trophy as the league's best rookie. The following year, after the departure of John Tavares, Barzal was thrust into the 1C role, where he stumbled slightly. Not only did his defensive numbers take a hit, but he had a sophomore slump of sorts, putting up only 18 goals and 44 assists for 62 points, much lower than his rookie total of 85 points. This past season, he had a solid bounce-back year where he scored 19 goals and 41 assists before the season was put on hold, which would have projected him to be around 70 points in a full year. With the season coming to an end, Barzal's ELC is finished and he's becoming a restricted free agent. The Islanders need to lock up their star centerman, but how much will they need to pay him to do so? With the flat cap and the looming possibility of an offer sheet, will they be able to afford him? To answer these questions and more, we need to examine several factors. First and foremost, the Islanders' cap situation. We need to figure out how much space they have to work with and what kind of term this means they're able to offer. From there, we need to determine how much Barzal is worth. And I won't lie, it was very hard to find players from the salary cap era that are good comparables for Barzal. There just aren't many players like him. Because of this, rather than establishing bounds for Barzal, I will instead look at a few comparable players that were offered contracts of differing lengths to try and gauge Barzal's value on contracts of varying term. To end off, because it's fun, I'm going to go a little rogue and take a quick look at two teams that may give the Islanders an offer sheet scare. Focusing on the Islanders' cap situation, they have just north of $8.9 million in space for the upcoming season. With guys like Matt Martin, Ryan Pulock, and Devon Toews all needing new contracts in addition to Barzal, it will definitely be a tight squeeze. One way around this issue would be trying to get Barzal to sign a 2 to 3 year bridge deal in order to open up space so that they can sign him long term once that deal finishes. A short bridge deal is likely the best option for the Isles if they aren't looking to move anyone as a cap dump. Outside of a bridge deal, the Islanders will need to make some smaller moves in order to afford a 5-year Barzal deal, or some bigger moves to afford a 7 or 8 year one. This of course makes them vulnerable to offer sheets, which we'll talk about later. If we look at a 2-year deal, contracts like Leo Komarov and Johnny Boychuk come off the books, clearing $9 million in cap space. If they're able to add a 3rd year, they can add names such as Andrew Ladd and Semyon Varlamov to the list, of course assuming Ilya Sorokin works out. This would bring an additional $10.5 million in cap space. A 3-year deal will also hopefully end in a time where there is no longer a flat cap, which would be a great aid to the Islanders' cap woes. Combine this with important players like Beauvillier, Pelech, and Sorokin needing new deals after this coming season, and a 3-year bridge deal seems like the ideal scenario for the Isles. But what would a 3-year deal look like for Barzal? To answer that, let's jump into our first comparable player, Brayden Point. Another talented young centerman, Brayden Point played 3 seasons for the Tampa Bay Lightning, putting up 91 goals and 107 assists over 229 games. There were a lot of concerns and rumors circulating about his signing in Tampa, as Lightning were getting crunched by the cap at the time. In the end, they signed him to a 3-year bridge deal valued at $6.75 million per season, a total cap hit of 8.28%. Taking a look at their numbers, we see some stark differences between the two players. Their point breakdown varies significantly, with Barzal having 28.5% of his points represented by goals, while Point has a much higher 46% of his points represented by goals. On top of this, Point has an extremely high shooting percentage of 17.2% compared to Barzal's only 11.4%. While Barzal has a slight edge in points per 60, goals are often considered to be more valuable, which would give the edge to Point. If we focus on their ice time, we start to see some more similarities, with both players having close to the same amount of power play time, and Point being only slightly more effective on the power play compared to Barzal. Point also got a bit more time on the penalty kill during his sophomore season, but since then has mostly focused on the power play and even strength. So offensively, Point gets the edge over Barzal, but how do the two stack up in terms of defense and possession? Both players put up similar Corsi numbers over their first 3 seasons. However, when we add in the ozone starting percentage, we see that Barzal has the advantage in their first season, whereas Point has the advantage in the final 2 seasons. Looking at expected goals for and against, Barzal has the advantage for the first 2 seasons. While he has a higher value in both stats, his expected goals for does outweigh the additional expected goals against. We see this swap in the final year where Point has the higher expected goals for and against, but in this season both players have a similar difference, which leaves them on a level playing field. In the end, Point is the better goal scorer, but they both have a large impact on their team's offense and play a large role in the power play. On top of this, both players are close defensively and get a similar amount of ice time per game. While goals are a hot commodity, elite talent is an even hotter commodity, so I don't expect this difference to reduce Barzal's value much, especially because he produces at a slightly higher rate than Point. Line mate quality is also something else to consider, as many would argue that Point played with a much higher quality of teammates. If signing a 3-year deal, I wouldn't be surprised to see a Barzal contract around the same AAV as Point's, maybe slightly lower. Somewhere between 6.5 and 6.75 million per season makes the most sense to me. As I've said before, personally I think a 3-year deal makes the most sense from the Islanders' perspective, but what would a longer term contract entail? Enter our next comparable, Patrick Kane. While Kane might not be a center, he is without a doubt a fantastic forward. Like Barzal, he won the Calder Trophy in his rookie season, where he put up 21 goals and 51 assists for 72 total points. Over the next 2 seasons, he would score an additional 55 goals and 103 assists, bringing his 3-year point total to 230. Halfway through his 3rd season with the Blackhawks, Kane signed a 5-year extension valued at $6.3 million per year, or 11.09% of the cap at the time. The right winger was also part of the NHL's first All-Star team in the final season of his ELC. Clearly, Kane is a talented player, but how does he stack up against Barzal? The answer is quite favorably, it seems. Kane puts up more goals and assists than Barzal over a comparable amount of time. He does this with a similar amount of ice time as well, resulting in a higher points per 60 than Barzal. On top of this, Kane also has a lower assist-to-goal ratio, meaning a higher proportion of his points are goals when compared to Barzal. However, if we turn to special teams, we start to see an explanation for these point differences. Kane got significantly more power play time during his ELC, averaging almost a minute more than Barzal on a per-game basis. This extra power play time combined with Kane's 19% higher power play production means that Kane has a lot more power play points, 35 to be exact. These additional power play points more than make up for the total point gap between these two players, which is only 23. Unfortunately, expected goals for and expected goals against stats weren't widely used near the beginning of Kane's career, so Corsi and Ozone starting percentage will have to be enough. Here we see Barzal have the Corsi edge in their first season, while Kane takes the lead in the last 2. Although at the same time, Kane has a much higher Ozone starting percentage in the last 2 seasons as well, and this overwhelms the smaller Corsi advantage he has over Barzal. Overall, I'm leaning towards Barzal here. So what does this comparison leave us with? Barzal gets points for being a center and the better defensive and possession player. He is slightly worse on the power play and produces at a lesser rate than Kane overall, but this is accounted for by Kane's higher power play time on ice and production. At the end of the day, they are both clearly elite talents and should have a relatively similar overall value, maybe with a slight edge to Barzal. If we apply Kane's contract value to today's salary cap, we would get a 5-year deal for Barzal at a cost of $9.04 million per season. This would be a tight squeeze for the Islanders, who would need to move out some contracts in order to make this work. It would also take Barzal straight to unrestricted free agency, which isn't ideal. On top of that, it is dangerously close to the Tier 4 compensation cap for an offer sheet, slated to be around $8.7 million, which would cost the offering team 1 first-rounder, 1 second-rounder, and 1 third-rounder. I'm sure this won't come up again at any other point over the course of the video. We've covered short and medium-term deals, but what would a long-term deal for Barzal look like? For that answer, we look to Mitch Marner. Now, I know what you're thinking. Mitch Marner's deal is only 6 years. He's a winger. He's not a centerman. How is this a good comparable for a 7 to 8 year contract? I am aware of the general opinion on Marner's contract, but give me 1 second to explain. I will agree that Marner is slightly overpaid, but if he is a good comparable to Barzal, I think offering the same deal for 7 to 8 years would be a fairly accurate assessment of Barzal's value. This is based upon the generally agreed upon logic that buying unrestricted free agent years is more expensive than buying restricted free agent years. This means that adding an extra year or two onto the contract could make up for the fact that it is a slight overpay at a 6-year length. Basically, despite Marner's contract generally being seen as an overpayment, I think it could be a good evaluation of Barzal's worth on a slightly longer term. This all assumes that Marner is a good comparable for Barzal, so let's examine that belief further. We again see our comparable has slightly better offensive stats, with Marner having a slight point lead. He does so with less ice time, resulting in about a 9% higher points per 60. Both players put up a similar shooting percentage and also have a similar assist-to-goal ratio, meaning their point makeups are alike. As with Kane, we see that Marner is more effective on the power play, though by a much larger margin since Marner produced more than Barzal with less power play time. The extra power play points Marner gets because of this higher effectiveness almost makes up for the total point difference between him and Barzal. If we look at possession numbers, we see that Barzal has the Corsi edge in their first season, but it swings into Marner's favor for the last two. This is reinforced by the ozone starting percentage, where Marner has a higher percentage in the first season, followed by lower percentages in the remaining seasons. Moving to expected goals for and against, we see Barzal have slightly higher values in both stats during the first two seasons, and a much lower value in both during the final season. Looking at total expected goals for and against, we see that Marner has the higher total in both stats, mostly due to the large difference in the final season. When comparing the net of these numbers, overall, Barzal has the edge here, with 25.3 to Marner's 15.1. This suggests that, in general, while Marner is better offensively, Barzal is better at shutting down chances, resulting in a higher net expected goals for, expected goals against. Concluding this, Marner and Barzal have similar point makeups, with the total point output edge going to Marner. Marner is more effective on the power play, but the power play point difference does account for almost all of the point advantage he has over Barzal. On top of this, Barzal is better both at eliminating opposing team chances, as seen through his lower expected goals against, and he is a centerman, which is seen as more valuable than a winger. So using Marner's contract value on a 7 to 8 year deal for Barzal, we would get an AAV in the ballpark of about $10.9 million per season. And guess what? This is almost exactly the same as the Tier 5 compensation cap for an offer sheet, which sits just over $10.9 million. This would cost 2 first-rounders, 1 second-rounder, and 1 third-rounder, which is certainly a price many teams would consider to get a centerman of Barzal's caliber. Now, as I've been teasing, Barzal is a juicy target for potential offer sheets. But what teams would be willing to, and are capable of, giving up the number of picks required to get Barzal? And of those, who's willing to risk their reputation and or hurt their relationships with other GMs in the league? Fair warning, this is less statistical and fact-based and more conjecture, so feel free to ignore this tangent. I think there are 2 major candidates for an offer sheet, and that's the New York Rangers and the Montreal Canadiens. Not only do both teams have the available picks, but both are among the richest teams in the league. With the rumored money problems a lot of teams are going to be having due to the pandemic, these are 2 teams that won't be afraid to continue spending big money. I could see both teams in a position to do a variety of different offer sheets, from a 5-year $8.7 million deal to a 7-year $10.9 million deal. Starting with the Rangers, they have a ton of picks to work with over the next 3 drafts and have performed much better than expected this season. Imagine having the 1-2 punch of Zibanejad and Barzal down the middle. He also fits quite nicely into their roster and cup timeline, which has a ton of young talent in every position. On top of this, they're adding Lafreniere this year, which is a big add. This contract wouldn't hurt them cap-wise, as they have a ton of space coming off the books next season, including Lundqvist, Stahl, and a large chunk of the Shattenkirk buyout. Worst case, they force one of their biggest rivals to sign a deal they can't really afford, resulting in them having to move out players that they'd rather keep. Best case, they get a high-skilled centerman that could push them over the edge in terms of being cup contenders. If we turn to Montreal, I think it only makes sense for them if they choose to get rid of Domi and Danault in this offseason. Gaining Barzal through an offer sheet and then moving Domi and Danault to get some help on the wing and defense would put Montreal in a decent spot to contend now. Their big names like Weber and Price aren't getting any younger, so augmenting them with some elite young talent helps both in the short and long term. We've also already seen that Bergevin is willing to offer sheet players in a time where so few GMs even consider it a possibility. And now, while offer sheets are fun to think about, for a player like Barzal, I think anything in the fourth tier of compensation will be instantly matched by the Islanders, as they won't have to move too much to fit that cap hit. But if a team is willing to go bigger into the fifth compensation tier, then things could get a little rough for the Islanders. In today's NHL, we likely won't see any offer sheets, but it's something interesting to think about. In the end, what does this all mean for Barzal and the Islanders? Let's recap potential contracts. For a short-term contract, we have a 3-year, $6.7 million deal, which would hit the cap for about 8.28%. For a medium-term contract, we have a 5-year, $9.04 million deal, which is 11.09% of the cap. And for a longer-term deal, we have a 7 or 8-year term, which would be a $10.9 million per season cost, which would hit the cap for 13.37%. As I've stated previously, I think the best option for the Islanders is trying to sign Barzal to a 3-year bridge deal. This would give them the opportunity to sign some smaller contracts this year without needing to move much money out via trades. It would also allow them to wait out some of their bad or unneeded contracts, freeing up more money to sign Barzal to a long-term deal after his 3 years are up. The precedent for such a deal has been set by Brayden Point, so we'll see if Barzal follows suit. While an offer sheet is certainly a possibility, I think it's unlikely we'll see one. But what are your thoughts? Do you think the Islanders should try to clear more room this offseason and sign Barzal long-term, or do you think the short-term deal is a better idea? Do you think we'll see anyone offer sheet him? If so, who? As always, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, and you can follow me on Twitter if you're interested in keeping up to date. Thank you once again, and I will see you guys in the next video.